I've had some conversations over the last couple of months with Sarah and Hope, and then have talked with some of the patient advocates to plan tonight's training. And so I'm really interested to just kind of get rolling. So we have information tonight. You'll see the title, Navigating Emotional Responses. And so what we have found is that talking about cancer for folks who have survived or are still being treated for cancer can sometimes be a difficult experience. And so we're going to talk tonight about what that can look like and how people can navigate that and some tools to manage it. But I'm also most excited because we have 3 pivot advocates who are going to be here tonight to share their experience. So I have some objectives here. These were on the flyer that went out. I'm not going to read them all because it'll eat into our time for the more important things. So our agenda, we're going to talk about triggers. So we're going to talk about what it means to be triggered, what that can look like. We'll hear from our advocates and give some time for some questions and answers. And then we're going to dive into some tools that you can take home with you. And I think there's something for everyone here tonight. And then we'll finish with some questions and answers and some discussion. So let's start with what's a trigger? And first, thinking about triggers, so you see these dominoes, right? It's something that happens outside us that can set off a response inside us, right? And that can happen for all kinds of reasons and in all kinds of ways. Sometimes a trigger is related to a traumatic event. That doesn't always, though. So we can be triggered about other things that we wouldn't necessarily think of usually as a traumatic event. But a trigger evokes an emotional response, which usually we can feel in our body. So emotions are connected to responses in our body. And sometimes those body responses are the first sign to us that there's something going on. So I want to just stop for a minute, and I want to give us all a chance to think about the last time, and don't worry, you don't have to share, not now anyway, but to think about a time when you yourself were triggered. So just for a moment to think about like what led to that. So like what was the outside event that led to you feeling triggered? What were your emotional responses? So what happened? Oh, I apologize. What happened inside you? So like what was the emotion that you felt? But then also what was your body response? What did you feel there? And so just for a moment, just to kind of reflect on that and kind of remind yourself of that experience. And I want to just share an experience of mine. So when I was writing these slides, I thought, okay, let me think about a situation. What's happened for me? So my father had a massive stroke about 7 years ago, a stroke so massive that it left him with some really significant limitations physically. He hardly can speak and can't do most things for himself. And it was quite a long process to even get him as well as he is now. And so I found myself a few years ago at a gathering of friends, and people were talking about some things that had happened, and somebody's father was working on a mission project, helping build houses. And I suddenly was just hit with this emotional response that really surprised me. And this thought of like, oh, that would be my dad. Like if my dad hadn't had a stroke, he'd be doing that. He would go on this trip and help build houses for people who need houses. And the emotional response, like I just suddenly found myself crying. I had to leave the table. Like I left, I was, really tearful, and it really kind of took me by surprise. And I think that experience isn't super atypical, right? So like I probably thought, oh, I grieved that all of those losses related to my dad. And I still sort of think that's in some ways true, but obviously not fully, because that emotion came up for me. And I share that example, and I'll use that example a little bit. We'll come back to it a little bit, just as a way to sort of think about, like, what are the things that happen? And I want to give you, and the reason that I said, like, let's start by thinking about a time when you were triggered wasn't to make you feel uncomfortable, but to give us all that experience of, like, what is that like? And how did I respond? And then for us to think about, if that happens again, what can we do differently? And so just because we're triggered, or just because an experience is triggering, doesn't mean that we have to avoid triggers. So we've got tools tonight that'll help us manage so that we can still participate in our life fully and manage. But we know that we can manage triggers better by understanding them better, by understanding when they're likely to happen, what's likely to trigger us, and then what we can do about them. So there's some things that make us more vulnerable to triggers. So this first little phrase you've probably heard before. So if we're hungry, if we're angry already about something else, if we're already tired, or we're not sleeping well, if we're lonely, if we have an anniversary date, so either anything related to our cancer experience or one's cancer experience, or anniversaries for other losses. And anniversaries can sometimes really catch us by surprise. So I've had people tell me like, gosh, today was really hard and I couldn't figure out why. And then all of a sudden it hit me. My mom died 10 years ago. And so sometimes there's a part of us, I believe, that doesn't even, isn't consciously thinking about a date, but that date is still significant for us and still kind of captured in our memory and will still sometimes affect how we feel. But we're also going to be more vulnerable to triggers if we're not doing all of the other things that keep us managing ourselves well. So if we're not exercising, if we're not doing other self-care, if we're using any substance. So even for folks who typically might drink alcohol and do fine with that, if just drinking any alcohol can sometimes make us more vulnerable. But if we're sick, even like cold or flu, if we had a med change or having hormone changes, all of those things can make us more vulnerable. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides because I really want to give us a chance to hear from our advocates. So we have 3 advocates here with us tonight, Kathy Bennett and Tracy Mason and Jenny Mack. And I know Sarah is going to have us all spotlighted, and we're going to just have a conversation, the 4 of us, about their experiences. And so I'm going to, as I call on them, I'm going to give them an opportunity to share how long they've been involved with Pivot and why they're a part of Pivot. But then I'm going to ask some questions. And so let's do introductions first. Tracy, you can just share with us, like, how long have you been doing Pivot and what keeps you engaged?
Okay. I am a breast cancer thriver. I got involved in Pivot in 2019 of December. I joined because I had just finished radiation, my mastectomy, and I just wasn't, I had no voice. And with Pivot, I have learned that I can have my voice again. I can tell my story. It's helpful to someone else. And that's really what I thrive off of now. I have found such companionship with people who have lived my life, and I have been able to help them. They've been able to help me. So that's
Thank you for sharing that. That's really lovely. Jenny, how about you? How long have you been involved in Pivot, and what got you started and what keeps you coming back?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Jenny Mack. I'm a 4.5-year survivor of stage 4 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Primary site was brain, and I had autologous stem cell transplant as well. I kind of feel like when I survived, I survived for a purpose, and it kind of gave me a reason to keep going. And I joined Pivot because I wanted to be able to improve the experience that other people going through cancer have, and also to help improve the outcomes that people have with cancer, not only for everybody else, but for myself. And I joined Pivot, it's probably been a couple years ago now.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. Kathy?
Sorry. Hi, I'm Kathy Bennett. I've been with Pivot a couple years, and I'm a co-survivor. My husband had colon cancer. He had a 2-year colon cancer journey and died about 2.5 years ago. And it was just such an intensive process. And I feel like I learned so much, and I saw a lot of things that I would have liked to have been better. And so I was looking for some sort of opportunity to be able to give back and contribute to making that process better for future patients. And that's when I came across Pivot.
Great, thank you. Well, so Tracy, let me start with you. You shared with us kind of a story about a way in which, like, talking about cancer research really left you one night kind of reeling. And I wonder if you can share that experience with us today, because I think it's a really a painful but also really helpful example.
Yeah, it takes a lot to trigger me. But I am part of course, the researcher pivot partnership. And during one of the presentations, they were talking about radiation, and I had 33 rounds of it. And I got off that call and I spent the entire night Googling and sending my onco team tons of messages. It took probably about mid part of that day before they were able to calm me down and assure me that, they were on top of it. They know what to look for. But yeah, I was completely triggered. I mean, I probably have, I don't even get that triggered for when I have scans. I do, of course, have scan anxiety when it comes up, but I don't spend all night Googling.
Yeah, and so it sounds like that experience really led you to question, like, have I done the right thing? Am I doing the right thing? Should I be doing something different? And I know that was kind of a common theme when we talked, and that questioning coming up, and how hearing other people's stories or hearing about new research leaves you wondering, like, am I doing the right things now?
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Because, like, when you're in the middle of treatment, you just do. They put you on a schedule, you just do. You don't react, you just do. And you don't think about everything that you have done to yourself until it's all over. And then that's where, like, the real healing starts.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. Yeah, Kathy, you shared a story that was a little bit similar, and I wonder if you'd like to share that with us.
Sure, it was actually the same incident, the same story, but triggered me in a very different way. Because from the caregiver perspective, Cheryl was telling the story, and I could just sense the anguish that they did not know this until she's hearing this now, after it's too late, and there's nothing, you can't go back and change things, and so. It really, I had to go off video for a bit, just because I was thinking that, we probably had incidents too, my husband and I, where maybe, things could have gone differently. And I have to just keep telling myself that does no good going back. You can't go back, you can't change it. You made the best decision with the information you had and what was happening at the time. And so you just have to go forward. But it did trigger, that very same incident triggered me as well.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. Well, and I know, Jenny, you talked about, when we talked, like, that you've sort of developed some strategies for managing and taking care of yourself. And I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I've done quite a few of the rapid reactors. And so you never know what's going to trigger you. I mean, I've had them talk about a male cancer, and something in there triggered me that was universal for us all cancer patients. And so what I found that has helped me the best after I do one of those sessions is I usually do a quick meditation, not a long one, but just enough to kind of acknowledge what I was feeling, let it go, and then I'll try to do something that I enjoy, going for a walk outside, doing some sort of craft or art activity I like, but just doing something enjoyable to get me from doing your Googling and looking things up on the computer and thinking about it. So
Yeah, that sounds like that's been an effective strategy. And I know that one of the things we talked about when we met last week is this thing that I think will happen, the very work that is so inspiring for you all and motivating to keep you coming back can also, hopefully, if things go well, right, there will be new discoveries. that Kathy, for example, may find later, like, oh, if that had been here before, that might have saved my husband. Or, Jenny and Tracy, like, oh, I might not have this side effect or after effect, that I did have or do have if I'd been able to have this new treatment. And so it's kind of a bittersweet process, right? And I think that can be, when we talked about it, like on the one hand, of course, that's what you want. That's why you're here. And, sometimes that can bring up some different kind of pain. Yeah. Anybody want to jump in and say, like, what's one or two things that you'd want a researcher to know about working with advocates?
That it's probably not, it's not something they did. It's just something that, we don't even always know why or how it happens. Like my bereavement counselor tells me grief comes in waves, and sometimes it's a little wave and sometimes it'll knock you down, and you don't know when it's going to come up. So it's fine to just take a pause, maybe say something about how, okay, I can see this is difficult. Let's just take a pause or something like that. And as an advocate, I feel I can. The researcher I work with, I feel I could say to him also, hey, I just need a minute. But do what's right for yourself, and ask for a little time if you need it, and just take some breaths.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jenny. How about you? I know you were going to share.
Yeah, for researchers, I would just say to keep in mind that some of us are in treatment, some just got out, and some of us are several years out. And even though we're several years out, just keep in mind that sometimes when we're talking about something, it can just bring you back just like it was yesterday. And so, and you never know what it'll be, but just to keep that in mind, that emotions are real. And yeah, just remember we went.
Right. Yeah, you've been through a lot, and even if it wasn't yesterday, it sometimes can feel like yesterday, and I think that can definitely happen
Whether
with
you're a patient or a caregiver.
Right. Absolutely. Tracy, any advice you would give to a new advocate? Like if somebody new is starting with Pivot, things that you'd want them to know that we haven't already talked about?
I think it's important that when you start down this path, that you need to try to remember that you're going to be able to help someone else just by simply telling your story. And when you first start, you don't think that is such an impact, but the things that we learn, they do. I mean, I have people all the time reaching out to me for advice, and it's hard to give them advice because all I can do is tell them my story. And I got lucky with my researcher, Nikki, that she, works with invasive breast cancer, and which is what I have. And I mean, she'll touch in every now and then, like if I have a surgery and stuff, she's always just like, I'm here if you need to talk, anything like that. And I have learned that the researchers, that most of them have their own cancer story, and that, we don't even have to tell them sometimes what we're going through because they probably have experienced it too. And I did not know that in the beginning. You always think, oh, you're on this side of the table, you don't understand where I'm coming from. But I have learned differently. I've learned that they all have their this is why they got into the job I think that they do. And so I just think that it's important to, remember that they're not talking about you. They're talking about their trial or their, whatever it is they're studying. And it's not about you. Sometimes it's just not about you. and you kind of have to disassociate yourself sometimes so you can help somebody else.
Nice follow-up. Thanks, Tracy. Jenny or Kathy, anything you want to add as we wrap up? And we're going to have some time for questions in a minute. So we'll see if anybody has questions for any of you. Okay. Thank you all for sharing your stories. Now, before we pivot, sorry, I can't resist, to slides again, I want to give people a chance to ask questions. And so feel free to either unmute to ask your question or submit it in the chat. And then Jenny and Kathy and Tracy can answer questions. And I'll just give us a minute or so. I know it always takes a second for the chat to catch up. Amy says, just want to thank the advocates for sharing and being so open. Yes, nice work, everybody. I think it's it's one of the things that I really appreciate about, and that I don't think I really touch on in our slides, is the vulnerability that it takes to talk about your story. So Angela asks, how have you been able to manage your mental health as a survivor? Does anybody, Jenny or Tracy, either of you want to take that?
I can. I have really got into a lot of resilience classes. So I do many of those. I do a lot of things with Gilda and Turning Point. And I've learned a lot of meditation. Meditation has been a lifesaver for me. So I really enjoy doing that.
Great examples.
And I am one of those people that I have to talk it out. Like I have to FaceTime a friend and I just have to vent almost and just get it out, because if it stays in my brain, I will never be free. So I have to vocalize it.
Oh, great. Thank you. Kathy, anything you want to add as a co-survivor? Like what helps you manage your mental health?
A lot of it's very similar to Jenny. I've taken some resilience classes, and actually 2.5 years out, I am still part of the Gilda's Club, Living with Loss group, getting together with people who get it, who understand what it's like to lose your person. So I think that's really important, having that support network available, whether it's friends, family, or people in a similar situation that you've just bonded together with.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. I see another question in the chat. When wondering if there have been any studies about the health situation in cancer caregivers. And I know this is something that there's been a fair amount of research on. Does anybody else besides me want to address that question? So I know actually there's some interesting research that's happening right now. Memorial Sloan Kettering is doing it. They are looking at their meaning-centered psychotherapy. So this is a psychotherapy that's been developed primarily actually for people with advanced cancer. And they are also looking at an adaptation for that for people who are cancer caregivers. So, I know, and that's just one tiny example of a way that people are starting to address the mental health for people who are cancer caregivers. But if somebody else has an example or has some specific examples that they want to share, feel free to unmute or send them in the chat.
Actually, I have a question for Kathy. Kathy, did you ever, I know as being the patient, I rely on my family as my caregiver sometimes. Is there ever a burnout? And is there anything that we could do to help them not get burnt out on us?
Well, yeah, there can be burnout, frustration, and more. I can think of a time when my husband really had no appetite and he was very weak. He had to eat. And so it was just that kind of, frustration of, well, what would you like? Try this favorite food. And then it was just like, oh, it just doesn't taste right. And so there is frustration. I don't know that there was anything he could have done differently. He was of course fighting for his life. just as hard. But sometimes you just the treatment, makes things taste different, makes you not have an appetite. A lot of things that are outside of his control. I think what might have helped us more is more knowledge, as much knowledge as possible about what some of those side effects were. Some we knew, but some were a surprise, a total surprise. That he was so dehydrated that 3 times a week he needed to get IV fluids. We were not prepared for that. And if you're dehydrated, you're not thinking clearly, and it's very difficult to even get up and move around. So I think the system just needs to be built to make sure that all of those side effects and things like that are brought up, because you need to know what to do when they happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And Angela shared in the chat that she agrees and that she thinks side effects aren't fully explained. And I know my social worker colleagues and I have talked about this as well, that we sometimes, we don't know if maybe physicians or healthcare providers are trying to sort of shield people or don't want to give people the, like, oh, here's this, put ideas in your head, like it could be this bad. And yet, like you say, you can't prepare then as well if you don't know that it could happen, or you don't know that what questions to ask to manage, and then that can make things more difficult. Well, I really want to thank you 3 for sharing your experience. We will have more time for questions and answers. And so if any of you think of questions for Tracy or Jenny or Kathy, we will have time at the very end for questions again. And so it would be totally fine to ask questions if you think of something you're like, I wish I would have asked. You'll have time again in a little bit. So you 3 aren't off the hook yet. We might have more questions for you. I'm going to bring my slides back. So Cheryl said there's been a study that she's read about addressing the negative impact on caregivers, and she's looking for it. So she will share that with us, I'm sure. So let me bring my slides back up and let's talk. So I developed a little bit of an acronym, and I kind of debated. I was like, oh gosh, so should I develop a new acronym? Do I have evidence for this? And I thought, okay, everything in this acronym has its own evidence base, and I just put it together in a way that was easy to remember. So what I want us to think about when you're managing triggers, this acronym of ANCHOR, ACT. So, and we're going to go through each of these pieces today. And so this first piece is about awareness. And so really what we know is when we can be aware both of what might trigger us, so kind of knowing ahead of time the sorts of situations that are possible triggers, and then what it feels like in our body when we are triggered, it can be really helpful. Now, sometimes, in my experience at least, and I would say my experience with my dad, you might not know until it's happened once, right? And that's okay. So if the first time catches you off guard, the next time you're going to have some knowledge and some information like, oh, these are the sorts of things that could trigger me, or this is what it felt like when that happened the other time. And so you're going to want to think about being aware before you enter a situation of possible triggers. So like you're going into a rapid reactor team, like knowing like, oh yeah, this is the sort of thing I could get triggered tonight. And then if you're being triggered, to work to be aware of both your body sensations and your thoughts. So because those are going to be clues. What happens in our body is often a clue to us about what's happening for us emotionally. And we may notice the body before we notice the emotion. So, but then from awareness, so that's the A, and then we go into N, and N is about naming it. So both naming the trigger and naming the emotion. And so there's research tells us that when we can name the feeling, but get a little bit of space from it. So you can see here, we can say to ourselves like, wow, I'm feeling triggered by what I heard. But when we can be curious about it, instead of judgmental, instead of giving ourselves a hard time for it, right? So like kind of our default sometimes is to say like, what's going on? Why am I feeling like this? But instead to be able to just say like, oh, interesting. Wow, I didn't expect to feel triggered by this. Knowing that it's okay if you got caught off guard, but giving yourself a little bit of space, that you don't have to become the emotion, you don't have to become the trigger, but we can just name it. So it sometimes can be helpful to name it out loud, right? So like if you need to, Kathy kind of gave that example. Sometimes you may have to say like, hey, I need a minute. Notice I didn't say that Midwest nice, like, hey, I'm sorry, I need a minute. You don't need to apologize. But I'm feeling kind of emotional right now. Like, and depending on the relationship, you may decide if you're going to share that or not, right? So like if your emotion's more intense, like that night for me when I was at the dinner table and tears started rolling down my face, like I kind of like people like were like something's up, right? Or my friend who came to see me when I left the table knew that something was up. And so sharing makes sense in that situation. Or if you have a good relationship, like Tracy mentioned, she's got a great relationship with her researcher. They know each other well. Like sharing that, like, hey, wow, this is feeling kind of overwhelming right now. You don't have to share everything, right? You don't have to say like, when that person said this, then I suddenly found myself feeling this. Sometimes you might want to, but you might not need to. Just saying, that felt overwhelming. I need a second to take care of myself. But you'll want to think about like not blaming yourself, right? So you're not weak or wrong for having an emotion or feeling emotional, but also the other person most likely did not trigger you on purpose, right? Even when it can feel like it, even when you're like, oh, why did they say that like that? Most of the time, people are doing their thing. They're having the conversation that they're going to have, and that response is coming from inside us. So, but then we want to think about naming your emotion if you can. So there's this phrase that's widely spoken that naming your emotion can help tame them. So that little rhyme can kind of help us think about it. So being able to just put your finger on it, like, oh, and again, get some space. So I'm noticing that I'm feeling angry or sad or overwhelmed by what I just heard. Again, probably just in your head. Don't necessarily have to say it out loud, but just the in your head naming can be really helpful. So the next thing though, so you're aware, you've named it, and that can happen in seconds, right? Like this is like a 2-second process sometimes. And then the next thing that really can help, because our body is responding, right? So you may even have like fight or flight get triggered, which is what happens when our brain says, hey, maybe there's a danger here. Even though you're not in any danger right now, if you're bringing up something that was traumatic before or difficult before or life-threatening before, right? Then your body may respond as if your life is in danger again. And so when we can calm our body, we can bring our brain online easier. We can think through what to do next and kind of decrease some of that feeling of being flooded. So the emotion's not wrong, right? I'm not saying calm yourself so you don't feel the emotion. Calm yourself so you can think through what you do next. So taking some deep breaths can help us calm our body. Notice I've even slowed down the way that I'm speaking, because when we can even do that, we communicate something to ourselves, which can help us feel calmer. So you can stop and just really feel your body in your chair, your feet on the floor, maybe taking a drink, really noticing the taste of it, the temperature of it, even the texture of your mug in your hand, right? Really allow yourself to just be present, just right here, right now, one moment at a time. Because what can happen when we feel flooded is your brain is like, oh my gosh, like I think about Tracy, like, oh my gosh, I gotta spend some time on Google and figure this out, like right now, right? But telling yourself like, okay, wait, just be here right now. I'm just sitting in this meeting. Or I have this other thing I'm going to do and I'm just going to be there. I don't have to solve this right now, or I don't have to go back right there right now until I want to, until I'm ready. And then once we have done that, you may need to remind yourself that you're safe. So even just really like, hey, things are okay, I'm safe now. You can do some grounding exercises. And so I put those in the resource slides at the end so that you can reference them. So sometimes people are like, oh, I already know how to do some grounding. And if you're like, I've never heard of that before. Grounding is just really about bringing your attention to the moment, getting grounded in the moment. And there are a handful of exercises in the slides at the end that you can reference. So the next, the O in anchor, is to offer yourself compassion. And you'll see, like, I didn't even think about it, but here I am, hands on my heart, just like our model here in this photograph. And so being able to offer yourself compassion by being kind to yourself, maybe saying something kind to yourself, like, this is difficult to remember, this is difficult to think about, or that was hard to hear. Even reminding yourself that you're not alone. Like everyone feels triggered sometimes, right? That it happens to us all. But there's also that very physical experience of offering compassion to yourself that can be really helpful and soothing. So you notice I said, hold your own hands, or you can put your hands on your heart. But sending yourself compassion, just like you might send a hug to a friend, can be really helpful. So that we can, that you can connect with yourself. And take care of yourself. So we can be compassionate in what we say, but we can be compassionate in what we do. And we can also, like, there's some more, when we get through some more of these tips, there's some of the doing things, some of the, if you're going to take care of yourself, what would you do? And if you're reading this and you're like, I have no idea, I've never heard of self-compassion before, I don't even know how to do that. A way to start is to think, if this were a friend of mine or somebody I know from Pivot and they called me and said, oh my gosh, that was a tough meeting, what would you say? And we can start there sometimes and can help us make some changes to take care of ourselves. And so I apologize. Every so often, slides don't advance like they're supposed to. I'm sure that happens to other people too. And so then the R is to respond as you need to. So if you feel like you can be effective in what you need or want to say, you can say it, right? So if it's like, oh, I need to offer somebody feedback right now. Once you've sort of calmed yourself, you've calmed your body, you're able to get your thinking brain online, then you may decide, like, I need to say something. This person, I want to share some of my experience. Or you may need to sit down later and brainstorm some solutions for what to do next time, right? But like Tracy's experience, if you have some questions for a professional, like, so once you've sort of gotten yourself back into kind of a wise place, if you can, and sometimes you can't. Sometimes you're like, I am feeling so emotional about this, I can't do anything until I hear from my provider, right? So figure out who you need to talk to. Do you need to call your oncologist or message them through the portal? Do you need to talk to your therapist? Is this more of a like, I was triggered emotionally and I need some help through this process kind of thing? So figuring out who that is and talking with them. But another response, so other things you can do to help respond. So seek out help if you need more support. So, it can be helpful to have some friends or family members, like Tracy mentioned, right? Like, I've got some people I can call. I've got a team who I can call. But also one of the things that I am making available to Pivot members, and my information is in later slides and the resources. But, if you're like, I don't have a therapist, all my people are gone, I just need to talk this through and figure out, like, do I need to see a therapist? Like, well, is this something that's going to come up again? I need to talk to a professional for one time to help me sort this through. You can call me, you can text me, and we'll set up a time to talk more, so that we can figure out, like, yeah, maybe it would help you to see a therapist. Maybe you've got some things that you're still dealing with related to your cancer journey, and then it could be useful to talk to someone. But there also are some more resources on the side. So, like, let's say you're like, yeah, maybe I should see a therapist. Gilda's Club is available, and I have their information. Or if you think, like, I just need more support, but maybe not a therapist, Turning Point classes, like Jenny mentioned, or Gilda's Club classes can be helpful. So, so the last two, we have the A and add is accept. And this is probably one of the most important, but also one of the most difficult slides in the slide deck, because really it's about accepting the things that you can't change. And there's often when you find yourself in the place that you are now, you may look back, or when you learn new things, you may look back and think, if only, or I wish, right? And that can be so painful. And it's okay to feel that emotion, and it's okay to have that, and to pay attention to it, right? To name it. But ultimately working toward a place of saying, I can't go back. We don't live in a world that lets me go back, right? That isn't, that's some science fiction reality, but right now it's not the reality that we have. And I think that the way that we get there is to notice when your brain takes you to non-acceptance, right? So notice when you get to that, like, if only, or I wish, or why I can't, or why didn't it happen like this? and then kind of go back to, this is what I need to accept. And you may have to do it over and over again. Acceptance isn't just sort of like a one-time deal. Like, I turned 18 and now I turned 16 and I can drive a car and I'm done. Acceptance is something you have to keep doing. Sort of like if you got in the car every day and you kind of had to remind yourself of what you had to do or go through the process again, that's kind of what acceptance is like, is every time it comes up, non-acceptance, kind of paying attention to it and doing something about it. And I'm using my acceptance skills to notice that my throat is really dry. And if I don't drink, I'm going to cough in a minute and then I'll be distracted even longer. So now this last piece is about taking care. So taking care of yourself afterwards. Jenny mentioned planning time ahead, like, okay, I need to meditate. I need to do something that's enjoyable, or maybe something soothing. Keep offering yourself compassion and validation. So like, it may be that even if you do that once, like later on that evening, that emotion still may be coming up and you need yourself still to say, yeah, this was just hard. Like, it's hard to remember those things, or I don't know why this is harder this time than last time, but it just is. There's acceptance again, right? Like, I'm not sure, but this is what is. So continuing to take care of yourself. We know, though, that when we have a regular practice of mindfulness or relaxation exercises, meditation, that those things can help our mind and our body respond more effectively when we're stressed. So, when you think more globally about like, what can I do to take care of myself, or even like back to what can I do to reduce my vulnerability, then having some kind of regular practice. It doesn't have to be a long time. Like there's research now that shows us that, in fact, the phrase is small moments many times, or short moments many times. Mindfulness researchers are showing us that even just small ways that we're mindful throughout every day can add up for us into increasing our overall wellness. And there's some resources and apps on the resources slide. So if you're like, I don't know where I'd start, then we have some. And I have some of the ones that I particularly like. There are a few that are free that I think are really good. So don't let cost dissuade you from trying something. So another thing, as Kathy and Jenny mentioned, you could consider taking a resilience class. So resilience classes are something that I have been offering over the last little over a year, mostly initially to folks who are staff at cancer centers around the state, some of our MCA cancer centers, but I've had some Pivot members join in the past. And I'm going to offer one later this month. So the last Monday in October, and then the first 3 Mondays in November from 4 to 5. So it's 1 hour, so 4 hours total. You don't need to attend all 4. So really, I have these designed so that it's different material each week. But if you have to miss one, or you can only make one, you'll still get something out of just attending one of them. So I wanted to extend this just for Pivot members or researchers. So we probably will talk a little bit about resilience in light of cancer survivorship. So because I won't be opening this to anybody else. So please feel free to sign up, even if you've come before. There's a bit.ly here that you can use, and you'll get these slides. So I know Sarah will be sending them out, so you'll have that. The other thing, there's an email that I send out twice a week. Originally, it was 3 times a week, and I couldn't keep up with the writing. But resilience tip of the day. So these emails go out, and feel free to sign up. So it's a new tip every day. The idea is that it's something you can read in a minute or two to help you think about, like, what can I do to be more resilient? Like, how can I manage my overall wellness? And what could I do to manage? And Peggy, thank you. Peggy says she likes the classes and she loves the weekly tips. She's often sending them on to her husband and friends. And that's really lovely. I'm so glad that they're continuing to reach people. I designed that last fall because I had a lot of people sign up for resilience classes and not very many attend. And I thought either the word got out and they weren't that awesome, or Maybe it was just that everybody had a lot going on and it was hard to attend classes. And so I was like, well, what else could we do? And oh, Becky, thank you. Becky also said she appreciates email. So feel free to sign up. We're getting some endorsements here tonight. It's free. And they, like I said, they go out from my email, usually Wednesday morning and Friday morning. Today, if you happen to notice, it didn't go out until afternoon, I think, or late morning. Every so often they don't get done quite on time, but usually Wednesday and Friday morning I get one out. So what can you do if you're a researcher, right? So like, let's say you're in a meeting and this comes up, somebody's triggered, then what can you do? So listen is the first thing, just being able to listen to what the other person's saying. Validate them. So validation is all about saying what you're saying or what you're experiencing makes sense. It's valid. It's a valid response. And even if you think, wow, that seems like a bigger response than I would have guessed, given what's happening for them, their response is their response. And so it's valid given that. So there's a list here of some things that you might be able to say. Things like, wow, that sounds really difficult. Or I'm so sorry that's been so hard. Let me know if I can help. Or, would it help if we took a quick break? Like, just like, hey, why don't we just take a pause? Let's come back in 5 minutes. If it's somebody that you is interested in talking, like take a minute to, talk with them off camera, or or offer resources if that's useful. And then what else can you do? So don't invalidate. So it's easy to accidentally invalidate people, but sometimes invalidating is, I think, more harmful than saying nothing. So, invalidating kinds of responses are things like, well, at least you survived, or it's all over now, you were cured, right? Like, kind of like, what's the big deal? Or, oh, you're fine, you're going to be fine. And sometimes that feels even ickier for people than if you said nothing, because it's like saying, hey, your response doesn't make sense. Your response is too big. You don't know how you're feeling. And that's a pretty crummy way to feel. So it's really important, though, and I think our advocates said this really nicely. It's really important for researchers to remember that it isn't necessarily personal, right? So whatever triggered them is probably connected to something that happened long before today or that day. However, how you respond can make that situation easier or harder. So it's both and. So both, it's probably not like you did something, and also what you do next can make things better or possibly worse. So that was only like 3 slides for researchers, like specifically, but I think in the context of what we're talking about, remembering all of those, that all of those other tools are things that you have at your disposal for yourself as well. Now I had hoped to get to the question slide by 5:50, and it's only 5:53. Only 3 minutes off feels not too bad. I'm going to give us a chance. So there's a question in the chat already. Is the resilience training virtual or in person? I am so sorry I didn't say that. Yes, it is virtual. So people can join from anywhere in the state, anywhere in the world. And I'm happy to have you. So whenever you register, a Zoom link will go out, and we will people can join that way. Just so you know, like the resilience trainings, I have slides, there's time for discussion. However, depending on I have learned, I don't know, maybe I've had 6 of these in this last year. Some groups are a little bit more interested in actually like unmuting and chatting and interacting, and some groups are busy. Like, I have somebody right now in a class who's in an office in her cubicle, and she's like, I can't really, talk, but I can chat. And so we will find our way through to what works best for the group that we have. So let's open it up to other questions, either in the chat or feel free to unmute. And I'm going to again remind us that you can ask questions of our advocates or me. Any of those are fine. And again, I'm going to give the chat a little bit of time to catch up.
I had a quick thing to say. I just wanted to say, it's not like you're triggered all the time with all the research and stuff that we do, but thank you for sharing this, because it's just nice to know that if you are triggered, what do you do with that? Where do you go? Who do you talk to? the resources are just good to have. So thank you.
Yeah, Jenny, that's such a great reminder, right? Like, even if you're triggered, it doesn't mean you're going to be triggered all the time. It's just it could happen. It could never happen for a long time and then suddenly surprise you. Other things that people want to comment on or ask. Thanks for the feedback, Deanna.
Hi, Karen. Thank you. I go. This is
Oh,
yeah. I've communicated with you via email, like get your your regular feeds, and I already signed up for the resilience class. I think this is fantastic. I think the researcher population that we have at KUMC would really benefit from a class like that, especially if it's virtual and there are only 4 1-hour classes. I think it's important. We have a lot of students that could benefit as well. Thank you for doing that.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And feel free to share it. So, I'm happy to have other researchers join us, or if you have students who are working with you, they can join as well. So,
Okay.
yeah, and you're right. I mean, this has been, I think even, and I have this conversation with people all the time, like overlaid everybody's cancer experience is COVID-19, right? And so like, this has been a really hard year and a half, and the isolation of that and the uncertainty of that and the changes, I think, have been really difficult for everyone. And so, which is part of why I started offering these resilience classes last year. And because I think, it's been a rough time. And so we have to be sort of more diligent with the things that maybe we didn't need to work as hard at before. Other questions or comments or feedback? Well, I really enjoyed being here with you all this evening. I really appreciate Kathy and Jenny and Tracy sharing your experiences. It was really valuable for everybody to be able to hear it. And so my email and my phone number are both in a later slide. So, please feel free to reach out if you have questions, right? So like, if you're like, I'm just not a person who asks questions in a big group, it is okay. Send me a question later. I'm happy to hear from you. Or if you think of something later and you're like, I just need to think this through, just reach out, and, I'm happy to, either through email or text or call, happy to schedule some time. So thank you, Terry and Eduardo and Dr. Chen. Appreciate your feedback. Sarah, anything as we wrap up?
I don't. Thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation, Karen. This was wonderful. I will send all the slides out to this group that were on the invite. So look for those so you can have the resources and Karen's information.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Sarah.
Good night, everybody.
Have a good night. Take care.
Yeah.